Life of Putin. Power Unveiled Part 1. Foundations of Power Chapter 1. Post-war Leningrad. The early years of Vladimir Putin's story begins in the ruins of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, a city still reeling from the devastation of World War II. Born in 1952, Putin's childhood was steeped in hardship, a product of the war's destruction and the iron grip of Soviet rule. As he grew up amidst the rubble and the cold, gray skies of Leningrad, young Vladimir internalized the tough lessons that would later define his approach to power, politics, and personal ambition. The streets of Leningrad were harsh, the effects of the siege, a brutal blockade that claimed the lives of more than 1 million citizens, still lingered. In this post-war landscape, survival was the most important rule. Food was scarce, housing was cramped, and the city had a palpable air of loss. Putin's family was no exception to this struggle. His father, a factory foreman and war veteran, was wounded in battle, while his mother narrowly survived the famine of the blockade. These familial scars of war created a stoic, disciplined atmosphere at home, traits that would soon be embedded into young Vladimir's own psyche. Growing up in a communal apartment, Putin was no stranger to the concept of shared space and limited privacy. The small, often overcrowded rooms were shared with several families, where the noise of daily life constantly echoed. It was here, in this cramped existence, that Putin first learned the value of control and secrecy, lessons he would carry into his future roles. To survive in this environment required sharp instincts, the ability to keep one's own counsel, and a shrewdness in navigating the complexities of shared living. The communal apartment was not just a living space but a crucible where Putin's early instincts for survival and control were forged. Putin was not the strongest boy in the neighborhood, but he was determined. From an early age, he understood that physical prowess and mental toughness were necessities. He honed these traits by engaging in fights with the rough boys of the courtyard, always seeking to outmaneuver those stronger than him. This harsh environment bred pragmatism in the young Putin, shaping his unsentimental view of power. In these moments, he learned to read the intentions of others quickly, to strike at the right moment, and to never show weakness. By his teenage years, Putin had developed an interest in martial arts, particularly judo. The sport offered him both a physical outlet and a philosophical framework for life. In judo, Putin found a way to discipline his mind, to control his emotions, and to harness his body. The principles of judo, using an opponent's strength against them, staying calm under pressure, and the art of timing, became metaphors for his broader approach to life and later, politics. In Putin's world, every move mattered, every action had a consequence, and patience was as crucial as force. Academically, Putin was unremarkable in his early years. He was neither the brightest student nor the most engaged. But something changed in him when, as a young man, he saw the Soviet film The Shield and the Sword, which glorified the life of a KGB agent working behind enemy lines during World War II. From that moment, Putin was captivated by the idea of secrecy, intelligence, and the quiet power wielded by those who operated from the shadows. He saw the KGB not just as an institution of state security but as the ultimate chessboard, where every move was calculated and every player sought advantage. It was a world where power was won not by brute force, but by outsmarting one's opponents, skills he had begun honing in his childhood courtyard battles. His dream of joining the KGB would come to define his early adulthood. After high school, Putin applied to Leningrad State University, where he pursued a law degree, a strategic move that he believed would position him well for his ultimate goal. His time at the university was marked by a careful balancing act. He worked hard, but never too hard to stand out. Putin understood that in the Soviet system, being too ambitious or too noticeable could draw unwanted attention. He flew under the radar, always calculating his next step. After graduating from Leningrad State University in 1975, Putin was accepted into the KGB, the culmination of a dream that had been forming since childhood. For him, the KGB was not just a job, it was an embodiment of everything he valued: loyalty, control, and strategic thinking. It was an organization that demanded the highest levels of discretion, something Putin had learned to master in his communal apartment and on the streets of Leningrad. As a young officer, Putin's KGB training shaped his worldview in profound ways. His training taught him the value of patience, how to gather information, and most importantly, how to blend into any situation without drawing attention. These lessons extended beyond his professional life and became part of his personal identity. Putin understood the importance of controlling the narrative, both his own and the one others told about him. His public persona would later reflect these carefully calculated choices. Putin's early years in Leningrad, his encounters with the brutal realities of post-war life, and his immersion in the secretive world of the KGB, all coalesced into a singular, defining philosophy: survival at any cost. Whether on the streets, in the halls of government, or in the covert operations of the intelligence world, Putin would always approach power with the same ruthless pragmatism. He believed that control was not just an advantage, it was a necessity. In these formative years, the essence of Putin was molded, hardened by the unforgiving landscape of post-war Russia, sharpened by the cold efficiency of the KGB, and driven by an unwavering determination to rise above the chaos that had defined his early life. This was the foundation upon which Putin would build his future, a future that would see him rise to become one of the most formidable and enigmatic figures of the 21st century. Chapter 2. The Soviet-influenced Vladimir Putin's rise to power cannot be fully understood without examining the Soviet system that shaped his worldview. Born in 1952, he was a child of the Soviet Union, and the ideological climate in which he was raised left an indelible mark on his personality and political philosophy. The Soviet Union, with its rigid doctrines of collectivism, state control, and ideological uniformity, provided a foundation for Putin's understanding of authority, loyalty, and governance. In many ways, his leadership style as the President of Russia reflects the values and strategies imparted by the Soviet regime. The Soviet Union during Putin's formative years was a society deeply influenced by Marxist-Leninist ideology. From an early age, Putin was exposed to the Soviet system of education, which sought not only to impart knowledge but to shape the minds of the youth to become loyal citizens of the state. In school, history was not just taught as a subject, it was a tool for the state to mold the next generation of Soviet leaders, workers, and soldiers. The heroes of Soviet history, particularly those who sacrificed their lives during the October Revolution and the Great Patriotic War, World War II, were held up as models of the ideal citizen: loyal, selfless, and always ready to defend the motherland. For young Putin, the Soviet state's emphasis on loyalty and discipline resonated deeply. In post-war Leningrad, where survival often required navigating complex social and economic hierarchies, these values of obedience and adherence to the state's directives were not just theoretical concepts, they were essential for everyday life. The Soviet school system was an early and influential part of shaping his perspective on power. It was here that he first began to internalize the idea that power was something to be respected, obeyed, and wielded with caution. Yet, despite the rigid nature of Soviet education, Putin displayed an early independence of mind, particularly in his fascination with intelligence and covert operations. He was a quiet, introspective boy, but behind his silence lay a sharp mind that absorbed everything around him. While other boys dreamed of becoming cosmonauts or athletes, Putin had his sights set on a different path: the KGB. This ambition wasn't merely about patriotic duty, it was about control, influence, and mastery of one's environment, traits that the KGB would later reinforce in him. The KGB, or Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности, Committee for State Security, was not just an intelligence agency, it was the guardian of the Soviet system. To Putin, it represented the epitome of power, a disciplined, secretive force that operated behind the scenes, ensuring the stability of the state. The KGB held a near mythical status in Soviet society, and for Putin, joining it was not just a career choice, it was the realization of a lifelong ambition. The allure of the KGB lay in its ability to control information, manipulate outcomes, and protect the Soviet way of life from internal and external threats. For a young man growing up in a system that valued order and control above all else, the KGB was the ultimate expression of state authority. By the time Putin entered the KGB, the Soviet Union was undergoing significant internal challenges. The economy was stagnating, political corruption was rampant, and the leadership seemed increasingly out of touch with the needs of the people. Yet, despite these issues, the Soviet Union remained a formidable global superpower, locked in a Cold War with the West. It was within this context that Putin learned the art of subterfuge, surveillance, and statecraft. His years in the KGB taught him to see the world through a lens of suspicion and competition, where every interaction had the potential to be a power struggle. This training deepened his understanding of the fragile nature of power and the necessity of maintaining control at all times. The KGB instilled in him a sense of mission and duty to the state, but it also fostered a deep cynicism about the true nature of politics. In the intelligence world, truth was relative, and outcomes were shaped by manipulation and control. This worldview would later become central to Putin's approach to governance, where transparency and democracy were seen as weaknesses, and where strength, secrecy, and control were paramount. Soviet ideology also imbued Putin with a strong sense of Russian exceptionalism. While the Soviet Union was officially a collection of republics, with an internationalist ethos, in reality, Russia was always the dominant force. For Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was not just a political disaster, it was a personal and national humiliation. He would later describe it as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. This sense of loss, of the diminishment of Russian prestige on the world stage, would become a driving force in his future leadership. Putin's mission would be not just to govern Russia, but to restore its place as a global power, a goal deeply rooted in the Soviet emphasis on Russian strength and dominance. The Soviet system also left Putin with a pragmatic approach to governance. While Soviet leaders spoke of Marxist utopia, in practice, the state was driven by realpolitik, a term that describes a political system based on practical objectives rather than ideological principles. Putin absorbed this lesson well. Throughout his career, he has shown a remarkable ability to adapt to changing circumstances, whether it be navigating the chaotic politics of post-Soviet Russia, dealing with Western sanctions, or projecting Russian power on the global stage. His decisions, though often appearing abrupt or unpredictable to the outside world, are almost always calculated, reflecting the same blend of pragmatism and ideology that defined the Soviet leadership. In many ways, Putin is a product of the Soviet Union's contradictions. He internalized its values of loyalty, control, and state supremacy, yet he also learned how to operate within its flaws, adapting, surviving, and ultimately thriving in the post-Soviet world. As much as he has sought to modernize Russia, Putin's leadership is deeply nostalgic for the order and prestige of the Soviet era, a time when Russia was feared and respected across the globe. It is this duality, between modernization and nostalgia, between pragmatism and ideology, that defines Putin's rule and shapes his vision for Russia's future. Ultimately, the Soviet Union may no longer exist, but its influence on Putin remains profound. His approach to power, his distrust of the West, and his vision for Russia's place in the world are all shaped by the lessons he learned from the Soviet system. As Putin himself has often remarked, whoever does not miss the Soviet Union has no heart. Whoever wants it back has no brain. Yet, in his own way, Putin has been trying to restore at least some of what was lost, ensuring that Russia, under his watch, will never again be relegated to the sidelines of history. Chapter 3. The KGB training grounds. In the shadowy world of Soviet intelligence, Vladimir Putin found his calling. His recruitment into the KGB in the mid-1970s marked a turning point in his life, one that would shape his future leadership and understanding of power. The Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности, KGB, or the Committee for State Security, was not merely a job for Putin. It was the embodiment of everything he valued: discipline, secrecy, loyalty, and control. To truly understand Putin's complex persona and his later actions on the world stage, one must first delve into the pivotal years he spent within the ranks of the KGB, where his worldview was shaped and sharpened. Putin's path to the KGB began long before his official recruitment. Growing up in post-war Leningrad, he was surrounded by the ruins of a city that had been a vital battleground in World War II. This historical context, combined with his fascination with Soviet war films, particularly The Shield and the Sword, fueled his desire to serve in the clandestine world of intelligence. To him, the KGB represented an elite corps, an organization that could wield influence without being seen, pulling the strings of power behind the scenes. Putin's recruitment into the KGB was both an acknowledgement of his potential and a reflection of the Soviet Union's desire to maintain its dominance during the Cold War. The agency was the linchpin of Soviet state security, responsible not only for external espionage but also for internal control. It was within this organization that Putin would develop the skills that would later define his political career: patience, secrecy, and the ability to manipulate outcomes. Upon being accepted into the KGB in 1975, Putin entered a rigorous training regimen designed to mold new recruits into masters of subterfuge, espionage, and psychological manipulation. The training was not just physical, it was mental, intellectual, and emotional. KGB operatives had to be able to blend into any environment, disappear when necessary, and always maintain an air of invulnerability. In the KGB, knowledge was power, and those who could collect it, control it, and act on it wielded immense influence. The KGB's training was designed to create disciplined agents who could operate in highly dangerous, covert environments. Putin was taught to surveil without being seen, to gather intelligence without leaving a trace, and to influence people subtly. He was trained in cryptography, counterintelligence, and psychological operations, skills that would later serve him well not just in his professional life but in his political strategies. The ability to control information, to deceive, and to maintain absolute discretion became central to his modus operandi. In addition to technical and operational training, the KGB emphasized loyalty to the state above all else. Agents were indoctrinated with a sense of duty to protect the Soviet Union from its enemies, both foreign and domestic. Putin embraced this ideology wholeheartedly. He came to believe that power, particularly in the volatile world of the Cold War, was fragile. To maintain it, one had to be constantly vigilant, always aware of potential threats. His time in the KGB reinforced his deeply ingrained belief in the importance of control, of information, of people, and of outcomes. Putin's first major assignment with the KGB came in 1985 when he was stationed in Dresden, East Germany, a country still firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence. Dresden was not the high-profile posting that many ambitious agents hoped for, but it offered Putin valuable experience in both foreign espionage and the more subtle art of dealing with a fractured state. East Germany was a critical part of the Soviet bloc, and its stability was paramount to the USSR. While stationed there, Putin worked in counterintelligence, tasked with monitoring East Germans, foreigners, and potential defectors. The Dresden years exposed Putin to the complexities of Cold War politics. His job was not glamorous, but it was critical to maintaining Soviet control in the region. He worked closely with the Stasi, East Germany's secret police, to keep tabs on dissidents and to counter the growing influence of Western intelligence agencies in the country. This period reinforced his understanding of how regimes stayed in power, not through democratic means or popular support, but through surveillance, intimidation, and control of information. Despite the relative isolation of his posting, Putin's time in East Germany was not without its moments of tension. As the Cold War began to wane and the cracks in the Soviet bloc widened, East Germany became a flashpoint. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Empire began to crumble, Putin witnessed firsthand the collapse of a regime that had once seemed unassailable. For a man whose career had been built on the idea of Soviet supremacy, the fall of East Germany was a sobering reminder of the fragility of power. During this time, Putin was forced to burn sensitive documents and evacuate the KGB office in Dresden as protesters approached. It was a turning point for him, a moment of disillusionment that would later fuel his determination to restore Russia's influence. In later interviews, Putin reflected on this period as one of the most formative in his career. The collapse of East Germany and the broader dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 represented the end of the world he had known and the beginning of a new era of instability. The fall of the Soviet Union was more than just a political event for Putin, it was a personal and ideological defeat. For years, he had worked within the KGB to uphold the Soviet system, only to see it disintegrate in front of him. This loss deeply affected his worldview. He later described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, a statement that reflects not just his sense of national loss, but his personal disillusionment. The world had changed, and Putin understood that if Russia were to regain its status as a global power, it would need strong leadership rooted in the lessons he had learned in the KGB. Putin's time in the KGB left him with a unique skill set and a deep understanding of power dynamics. His ability to remain calm under pressure, to assess situations with cold precision, and to manipulate outcomes would become hallmarks of his political career. His years in Dresden may have been far from glamorous, but they provided him with the practical experience and ideological foundation that would guide him as he later ascended to the presidency of Russia. The KGB instilled in Putin a sense of loyalty to the state and a deep distrust of openness and transparency. In the world of espionage, information was a weapon, and those who controlled it could control the narrative. As Putin would later demonstrate in his political life, this ability to manipulate information, to control not just what people knew, but how they understood it, was perhaps his greatest strength. In the years to come, as Putin navigated the turbulent waters of post-Soviet Russia, these lessons would serve him well. The KGB may have dissolved along with the Soviet Union, but its influence on Putin's leadership style remained deeply ingrained. He emerged from his years in the KGB not just as a skilled operative, but as a man who understood the true nature of power, its fragility, its volatility, and the absolute necessity of controlling it at all costs.